All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to day three of our study of imperialism here in Unit 6. In our previous classes, or previous lectures, we studied the motivations for imperialism. We also talked about some of the justifications. We also, in our previous lecture, looked at imperialism in Africa. Today, we're going to go to a different part of the world. We're going to look at imperialism in all of Asia. We're going to start with South Asia, which we call India. Then we'll briefly talk about Southeast Asia, places like Vietnam, and then we'll spend a bulk of our time looking at China today. I'll try to go through this fairly quickly. I do have a couple stories that I at least want to tell and share with you guys, but I will try to keep the lecture somewhat short because I want to be wary of your time. Let's start with our essential questions. Number one, what were the motivations and justifications? Already went over it in the lecture. You guys should already know that. Number two, in what ways did societies respond to and resist imperialism? What we saw in Africa was we saw three different types of responses. We saw the direct resistance, where we saw different rebellions take place. We also saw peaceful negotiations in which Africa tried to negotiate with the Europeans in order to prevent imperialism. And we also saw religiously based rebellions. We'll continue to see those type of reactions in other parts of the world. We'll mainly see a little more direct resistance today when we looked at these Asian societies. And number three, were the causes of migration, and how did societies receiving migrants respond to um, or how did they respond during this time period? We're going to see some of the causes of migration today. I'll briefly mention it, and then we'll be able to talk about it in more detail in a different lecture. Let's go ahead and get to our notes on the East India Company. When we last left India, we saw that India was under the control of the Mughal dynasty or the Mughal Empire. And we saw that the Mughal Empire under Aurangzeb tried to expand into southern India to take control. And we saw how weak the Mughal dynasty or the Mughal Empire became because Aurangzeb was having to pay all these. I'm sorry, he was having to pay for the Taj Mahal, so he had to raise taxes. He had to get more people in the society. He tried to convert them to Islam instead of leaving them as Hindu or Sikhs. And so all these problems exist. What I'm trying to get at is that India, under the Mughal dynasty in the 1700s, was really, really weak. So that made it very easy for the East India Tea Company or the East India Company to step in and start taking over. As we went over in Unit 4, the East India Company is a joint stock company, and so people pay into it in order to receive money back, either via dividends or any sort of other way that companies give out money to their shareholders. But the East India Company starts to take over southern India, and they are going to eventually control about half the world's trade. There's a lot of resources in India. It's the same reason that the British went into Africa because there's resources there. There's cotton, silk, salt, spice, tea, and opium, as we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, the East India Company is going to be the quote unquote government. They're actually going to take control of in the southern part of India. They'll actually have a standing army as well. And this is an example of economic imperialism in which a business controls large parts of land in another country and controls the trade and the economy of that country as well. So that's what we see in the East India Company. And that's the British, that's them getting the foot in the door for in India. We're going to see the British continue to be involved in India all the way up through Unit 8. So they're going to be there for a while. We see the response to this economic imperialism and its direct resistance. The first type of direct resistance we see is the Sepoy Mutiny. Now, in order to truly understand the Sepoy Mutiny, we have to back up a little bit. You have to remember that the majority of people in India are either Muslim or Hindu, and there's certain dietary restrictions for those religions. Namely, they can't have animal fat, so they're not supposed to eat pork or beef or anything from the cow. Like you're not supposed to eat from the pig or from the cow. Well, many of these sepoys who are Indian soldiers in the British Army are either Muslim or Hindu. And in order for them to load their guns, they have to rip open a cartridge. So it's a cartridge that has all the powder and the ammunition. They rip it open with their teeth and they pour it in their gun. The British start to oil that up and grease those cartridges up with animal fat from either pigs or cows, which is offensive to both Muslims and Hindus. So this greatly upsets the sepoys because they see this as an attack on their religion. They were already thought that the British wanted to come in and convert them all to Christianity anyways, and this continues to kind of insult the religion that they already have. So the sepoy mutiny occurs in which the sepoys, the Indian soldiers, try to fight back against the British army. We see the first individual, Mangal Pandey, is the first individual to actually start fighting. He fires at the British. And then realizes that that was a mistake, so he tries to run away. Eventually, he tries to kill himself because he knows that the British are going to get him and kill him anyways. But he fails to do so in his attempt, and he is eventually hanged. This begins the Sepoy Mutiny, in which the British will fight against the Sepoys, and things get very nasty very quick. There's many examples of violence. One of the most famous or infamous ones is at Kanpur, in which there were many British individuals there, mainly British women and children, who were hacked to death by some of the sepoys and thrown down a well. And the British respond by taking some of the sepoys, strapping their head to the front of the cannon, and then going ahead and launching a cannonball at them. So it gets violent very fast. And the reason that I bring up this violence isn't because I want to show or talk about gory events and make you guys scared or anything like that. But our next unit is going to be World War One, and we need to understand that prior to World War One, violence was becoming much more acceptable, quote unquote acceptable, in which people used violence, people and countries used violence in order to get their way. So we want to keep that in mind, that there's much more violence occurring in the lead up to World War One. So that way we can better understand why World War One occurs. It certainly does not come out of nowhere. So we see that this Sepoy Mutiny occurs, and then we get a switch in the way that the British rule India. The British, by this point, don't really trust the East India Company. The East India Company is pretty corrupt. Things have been going downhill for a while, and the Sepoy Mutiny just kind of highlights that. So the British say, East India Company, you are out. The government of Britain now has direct control. So, yeah, there's a minor change there, but if you're in India, it all looks the same. You're still being controlled by a British individual who doesn't look like you, doesn't have the same religion as you do, doesn't act like you, doesn't have the same culture, all of that. Now, how is it that Britain, this tiny island, can control India? How is it that 3,000 British who are living in India are controlling 300 million Indians? Well, they're ruling through intermediaries. What that means is that India is more of a protectorate in which the British don't have direct control. The British themselves are not the government, but they work with the government in order to influence their rule and influence their behavior. So these Indian princes who are the government are allowed to do whatever they want to do. I mean, they can make any decision they want as long as it aligns with British interests, as long as it doesn't ruffle their feathers too much. And the Indian princes are more than willing to do this because they get to keep their title, they get to keep a majority of their power, and now they have access to British goods and services. They have access to some of the best colleges and universities in the world for their sons. So many of the Indian intermediaries allow the British to have a little bit of say and a little bit of control. So we want to keep that in mind, that that is a way in which imperialism occurs. It's not always direct rule. Sometimes that rule through intermediaries, especially when it's a large population, is very advantageous to the mother country. Let's go ahead and move on to the pros and cons of British rule. If we were in class, we would be reading George Orwell's Burmese Days, and we would be able to see this, but we're not. So I'll just run through it very, very quickly here. The big pros of the British rule in India is that there's stability. The British bring in a much stability. Remember, the Mughal dynasty did not have stability. You had Hindus versus Muslims, and things were not stable. There was a lot of fighting there. The British bring some sort of stability to it because the British are so powerful. You also have very efficient government. The government of Britain has been around for a long time. They kind of know how to run things, but you also get access to industrialization and education because remember, the British are highly industrialized and they're going to bring that with them. The cons, however, are huge, and this is going to play a big role in Unit 8 when we talk about the decolonization efforts by India and people like Mahatma Gandhi. First one is manufactured British goods destroy Indian economies. If you're Indian textile maker, if you make clothes, you're out of business. You completely got destroyed by the British. I mean, this is almost equivalent to Walmart coming into an area and running the mom and pop shops out of town, those small businesses. That's essentially what's happening here. Taxes are going to increase dramatically. And the British need money. They have colonies all over the world, as we saw when in our lecture about the imperialism in Africa. And there's you need money in order to run all of that. So taxes are going to go up very, very quickly. They force Indian farmers to grow cotton. After all, it's a highly industrial society. We see that industrialization and imperialism go hand in hand. And instead of growing cotton, they're not growing food. And this food shortage ends up leading to the death of 30 million people. And then also, you get this idea that the Indians are inferior to the British. That if there was an Indian individual walking down the street and they saw a British individual walking down the street in the opposite direction, the person who is Indian would cross to the other side of the road in order to show respect for the British. So you want to keep that in mind as well. The British very much saw themselves as superior, and that kind of goes back to that social Darwinist stuff that we talked about at the very beginning of this unit. We're going to go ahead and skip a few of these, and we're going to get right to Southeast Asia. Now, this is our only slide on Southeast Asia. I want to talk about a couple things very, very quickly because they will be important, not necessarily right now, but they'll be important when we get to Unit 7 and Unit 8. Number one is the French. The French are going to go to what was called French Indochina, what we now call Vietnam, and they are going to take this area as well and have direct control over it. Obviously, they go there for resources, just like they engage in imperialism in Algeria. But it's important, this is important to keep in mind because when we get to Unit 8, we're going to be talking about the Cold War, and we'll be looking at the Vietnam War as well. And the French involvement in Vietnam is going to be important. So just keep in mind that the French are in this part of the world, which we call Vietnam. We already looked at Unit 4. In Unit 4, we looked at the Dutch VOC. We saw that they controlled the Spice Islands, which is this area right here in yellow. They're still going to stay there because there's so many resources there. And the British, as we saw in Unit 4, start to compete with the Dutch in this area. The British are going to take Singapore and all of these areas in this kind of red color that happens to be here. Once again, all those are for resources, including coffee, palm oil, rubber, spices, sugar, tea, timber, tin. All of those resources are what drive and motivate Europeans to take that area. The last part I want to bring up is the Philippines right here. We'll talk about this more when we talk about US expansionism, but keep in mind that the United States is going to control the Philippines because that will be important when we get to the island hopping campaign in World War II. Let's talk about China. So, what we've seen throughout our study of history is that there has always been a trade imbalance between Europeans and between China, with China being the beneficiary of that. We saw that with the Silk Road, that Europeans would go to China and buy Chinese silk and other goods, but the Chinese weren't necessarily buying the European goods. We saw the same thing in Unit 4 with the silver trade. Europeans would go to China, buy silk and porcelain and other things, and the Chinese would usually not buy any sort of European goods. Well, the same thing's occurring here, and the British are sick of it. They say this is absolutely ridiculous. We constantly buy things from China. They never buy anything from us. So our money goes to China and it never comes back. We never monetarily benefit. So they want to switch that trade imbalance. There's a famous mission that's taken in the late 1790s by Lord Macartney. He's a British individual. He goes all the way up to Peking in order to talk to the Qianlong Emperor, the leader of the Qing dynasty, in order to try to switch things up, in order to try to stop this trade imbalance. And the Qianlong Emperor pretty much kicks him out, says, no, absolutely. There's a famous quote that the Qianlong Emperor says, we don't desire anything from the Europeans. All the desirable goods are in China. That's why people buy things from us and not the other way around. So the British don't take this very nicely. They really want to change things around. So what they start to do is they start to take their land that they have here in India and they grow opium. What is opium? Opiates, the opioid epidemic that we see here in the United States. All of those words start with opie, right? Right. Okay, so they're all kind of related to one another. Opium is a drug. I would say it's similar to heroin, is at least what I've seen in my very brief research online. So it's highly addictive. Now, usually what happens with opium is that you light it and there's a special pipe and you smoke it, and that is how you feel the effects of opium. This is a very addictive chemical, or very addictive plant actually, in China. So the British are going to take their opium that they're growing in India and bring it over to these port cities down here like Canton and Macau, and they're going to start to sell opium. Opium is going to get into or enter the interior of China through these Chinese traders who are willing to do this in order to make a little bit of money. There's a lot of things that are going on here, in which a lot of bad things that are going on here. With the fact that the British are growing the opium, the fact that Chinese merchants are willing to sell it, we even get to a point where we see many of the missionaries are willing to sell opium. That's right. When we looked at Unit 1, we saw that religion was a reason for imperialism as well, that many of these religious leaders, like Christian priests, wanted to expand the faith and wanted to convert many of these savages to the Christian religion in order to save their souls. Well, all of that costs a whole lot of money. If you're a missionary in China, well, you're going to need money in order to eat, but you're also going to need money to produce the Bibles that you're giving out to people. How can you fund all this? You can fund it by selling opium. And so you'll actually see a few priests go door to door and sell opium, and somehow morally justify it because it's helping them spread the word of God. So there's a lot of opium that's being spread. Now the government has a couple different responses that they take to this. The first response is actually they talk about legalizing opium. Obviously, opium was illegal and was happening all under the table, but the government of the Qing dynasty says, well, wait a second, what if we just legalize it? What if we just put it all out in the open and we allow people to buy opium, and then we as the government just tax it heavily? That way we get a whole lot of money. They don't end up doing that, but it's a good thing that the United States would also never do that. I mean, it would be a really bad idea to get people addicted to a drug and then legalize that drug and then tax it in order for the benefit of the government. Hopefully you catch the sarcasm there. The other big response, and the response I actually probably should have got to a while ago, is direct conflict. So we see the Opium Wars. This is an incredibly one-sided war in favor of the British. Why? The British are industrialized. The Chinese, for the most part, are not industrialized. This is how most of the battles worked. The British would bring their big ships and bring them into these port cities. Look, I mean, all these port cities are right along the water, so it's easy to put a ship into the port, and these ships have big guns on them, so they would start firing at the Chinese in the city. Obviously, this was very frightening to the Chinese. Now, you might be wondering, okay, what's the Chinese response? Are they going to bring out their guns and their big cannons, start firing back? I'll just tell you one story to highlight how imbalanced this is in favor of the British. So there is a story about how one of these cities was being fired upon by the Brits, by these British ships, very industrialized ships that have a lot of big guns. And the Chinese people are running around, they're trying to hide. So they're running around, they're trying to avoid getting blown to bits. And there's a group of Chinese individuals who are kind of leading the resistance, and they eventually gather up in this building. And they gather in this building and they say, okay, what do we do? How can we stop the British? And they're all yelling and talking with one another. I mean, it's a very stressful situation. So there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of anxiety that's occurring. So there's a lot of noise out there. And there's one individual who's kind of sitting down in the corner because he is exhausted. He's been running around all day, didn't sleep well last night. He's just kind of sitting there, kind of dozing off and listening to people yell and scream at one another, panic about the British invasion. Well, he's looking around, and in the corner of the room that he happens to find himself in, he sees firecrackers. He's like, okay, firecrackers. They're pretty cool. He looks over to the other corner of the room, and he sees a monkey. And this monkey's just jumping around, scratching himself, doing little monkey things. He's like, okay, that's a monkey over there. And then he looks back at the firecrackers, and he looks back at the monkey. And he looks back at the firecrackers, And then all of a sudden a light goes off in his head and he says, guys, hear me out here. Here's what we should do. All right, these British have ships, right? So what we should do is we should take that monkey over there and we should take those firecrackers and we're going to tie the firecrackers all around the monkey. We're going to light it. Then we're going to take the monkey and we're just going to throw it on the ship, and that monkey's going to run all around. And the British sailors aren't going to be able to catch him because it's a monkey and it's freaking out. And then those firecrackers are going to go boom, and it's going to blow a big hole in the ship and it's going to sink. They don't end up doing that idea. So that unfortunately does, or fortunately or unfortunately, does not happen in history, but it does show this huge imbalance or this huge advantage the British have because of their industrialized society. It shows that the British, being industrialized, have a massive advantage over the people that they are attempting to conquer. The Chinese best response to British guns is a monkey with firecrackers on it. So it just highlights how ridiculous the imbalance is when it comes to industrialization. Ultimately, we get the Treaty of Nanjing, in which the ports are now open to the British. So originally, the British could only be allowed in Canton and Macau. Now they are allowed in almost all of these ports. They also get Hong Kong, and they also limit tariffs. What we see here is that the British are going to open up China. They're going to be able to trade with China and establish laws and other rules and regulations to help benefit the British as opposed to benefiting the Chinese. We start to see more economic imperialism take place in China. You would think that would be the low point for the Qing dynasty, but it isn't. So let's talk about what happens after the Opium War. After the Opium War, we get something called the Taiping Rebellion. Well, how does this start? We have to remember a couple things. One, there were Christian missionaries. We just talked about those Christian missionaries using opium in order to spread the word of God. Well, Christianity starts to spread in China. Second thing we want to keep in mind is that the Chinese economy is going south very quick. We just saw the Opium Wars. We just saw the Treaty of Nanjing benefit the British. So the economy is getting very bad. People are starving, peasants need access to food. That combination of Christianity and peasants needing food is going to lead to this Taiping rebellion. So we get this individual, Hong Ziquan, aka Chinese Jesus. Let's talk about this guy. So I'm just going to refer to him as Chinese Jesus. Chinese Jesus is converted to Christianity by these missionaries. One night he has a dream, and in this dream he is told by an angel of God that he himself is the younger brother of Jesus Christ. And it is his job to overthrow the Qing dynasty and recreate a heavenly kingdom, or create this heavenly kingdom in which the social and moral order of the Chinese is put back into line. I guess God works in mysterious ways. Talking to Jesus's younger brother who's born 1,800 years later in a completely different country. But what do I know? Anyways, Chinese Jesus is convinced that this is the way. He starts recruiting more and more people. He's saying, look at how corrupt the Qing dynasty is. And we talked about that a little bit in Unit 5. We saw that there was corruption, especially using the civil service exam. He says to the peasants, you guys are hungry, correct? And the peasants say, of course, we're hungry, we're starving, we're dying in the streets. He says, we're going to create a new society. We are going to set up a heavenly kingdom in which people own things communally. Obviously, this is very appeasing to the peasants who just want access to food and want to stop seeing all the high level corruption that's occurring in the Qing dynasty. And so there's a massive rebellion. They're centered in Nanjing, but there's a massive rebellion against the Qing dynasty. Now, ultimately, the Qing dynasty does win. They do put down the rebellion, but it takes 11 years and costs millions of lives. Anywhere from 20 to 30 million lives are going to be lost. What we're going to see in a couple lessons from now is massive migration out of China. The push factors are going to be the Opium War and the Taiping Rebellion. This will also eventually lead to the falling of the Qing dynasty in 1912 that we'll talk about when we get to Unit 8. We see that because China is so weak, it's so easy for foreign businesses to come in and start to take economic control. If we look at this political cartoon right here, we see China weighed down by France, by Russia, England, Germany, all of those countries are going to come into this now very open China, and they are going to take control because they're able to do so. They're able to set up trade rules and regulations that benefit them. And of course, you're going to do so if you're European because of all those things that we talked about all the way back in the first lesson. All those motivations for imperialism, all of them now apply to China, especially when China is in this weak state. We call this the spheres of influence, and that's definitely something we're going to want to write down. These spheres of influence are shown here on this map. So when we say sphere of influence, we don't mean that the European countries necessarily have direct control over these areas. It's just that they have trade control and economic control. So the government of China is still there. The Qing dynasty is still in charge. It's just that in the green area here, the British get to make all the rules when it comes to trade. And obviously, the British are going to make rules that benefit them. So we see the British, the Russians who have become industrialized start to come in as well. The French right here, the Germans too. All of them, there's this open door into China, and all of them are going to go through that open door in order to get their sphere of influence. Here's our last slide right here. This is about responses to that foreign influence. We already know that the Chinese are very wary of foreign influence. We saw that all the way back in Unit 3 and Unit 4 with the missions of Zheng He. Those voyages were ended up being shut down because they brought in too many foreigners. So the first part we need to know is that the U.S. is also going to get involved. And the U.S. is going to have this open door policy. Now, all this open door policy says, look, China's never going to be a country. China's never going to be a colony of any country. However, all Western powers, all Europeans, even the United States, will have equal access to the Chinese market. All of them get a sphere of influence. All of them have a chance to economically benefit from China. Now, with this increase in the amount of foreigners and amount of foreign control in China, we see direct resistance in the Boxer Rebellion. This group was known as the Brotherhood of the Harmonious Fist, which is a fantastic name for any group. And if you're thinking about starting a band, Brotherhood of the Harmonious Fist, totally use it. It's a great name for a band. They were upset with this foreign takeover and they started to attack foreign residents. Dowager Cixi actually encourages the Boxers because she is very much against modernization, very much against the foreign influence, and she wants them to take over. She wants them to push the foreign influence out. Well, as we saw in the Opium Wars, the West is highly industrialized. The Chinese are a bit behind. And so the foreign influence is able to take over very easily and put down the Boxer Rebellion. However, the Boxer Rebellion does show us how resistance many of the people were to these foreign influences. The last thing I want to break up, because this is actually our last slide, is that I want to go back to this slide right here. So we've already gone over India, Southeast Asia, and in China, but our next lesson is going to be about Japan. One thing I do want to leave you with is that one area I didn't talk about was this purple area right here. And we see that the Japanese have a sphere of influence in China. What we'll see in our next lesson is how a isolated country, remember last time we talked about Japan, was the Tokugawa shogunate. They cut themselves off from the rest of the world. So how does this very isolated island nation, tiny island nation over here, start to take a sphere of influence in one of the greatest, most powerful nations in the world? That's what we'll see in our next lecture, and I will see you guys then.